All right, so I'm going to share with you really 40, almost 50 years now of great radical adventure, ecology, theater, etc. And I always make my talks personal because it's more interesting to me. I think it's more interesting to audience. So, first slide. As a 22-year-old, recently minted Ivy League college graduate with no practical skills, kind of half running from the Vietnam draft and definitely saying not this, not this, not this, to becoming a doctor, a lawyer, a fire chief, anything that was kind of on offer from a conventional career, I had the really good luck of running into this band of mavericks who were at this godforsaken place. This is Synagogue Ranch, 20 miles outside Santa Fe in 1969. Devastated ecologically in a mere century of land misuse. Next slide. And the idea was that we would learn by doing. And what really appealed to me when I first got there, there's an inner work aspect to what's going on that we usually don't talk very much about, but we also believe in karma yoga. And the thing was, poverty and really limited material resources are a godsend, because that means you have to do the work yourself. You have to build your buildings, you have to do your electric, you have to do your plumbing, you have to make the adobe bricks to begin with, etc. You've got to plant your gardens and trees and grow your food and keep your cost of living down. This was really key to the Institute of Ecotechnics, because if you're really burdened with really high overhead, high cost of living, you don't have the opportunity, nor do your confreres, to try something new. So the three lines of work that I heard about that we would be doing concurrently: theater. So as Tony mentioned, a couple of years earlier, core of the group had been in Haight-Ashbury and in San Francisco. They formed a theater called the Theater of All Possibilities. We had a wonderful theater workshop by Josiah, and a lot of what he was talking about was what I discovered that theater opened the doors to. First off, you want to work with your organism. Theater is a fantastic school for developing your body, getting yourself into your body, learning to express yourself emotionally, learning about roles and dramas and the different kind of dramas that you can play. So Theater of All Possibilities, kind of like there are all possibilities on the stage, and there's no way you can separate, or should you want to separate, your theater abilities and the ability to see a drama and maybe pick better dramas to be involved in, and increase your ability to play more advanced and challenging roles. There's in-life theater. And then enterprise. We wanted to have projects that didn't depend on Big Daddy or the government grants or whatever. Having enterprise means that the projects that we're working on and individual people, we are supporting ourselves. And I think we're also influenced by the Sufi thing, in life but not of it. If you don't have an enterprise that interfaces with the public, and Tony's been warning about that, there's a tendency to we've created this wonderful inner group of work, and we don't need to have commerce with the dirty world of economics outside. So having enterprise actually ensures that you're getting feedback. Well, I may think I'm making really beautiful furniture, but does anyone want to buy it? So enterprise has a lot of benefits of getting you involved, and because we wanted to do new things, we wanted to be a model that could be reproduced, or we could inspire others, we could learn from others. And the third element was we wanted to work on ecology, and it was really clear the environmental movement was just kind of beginning. I think the first Earth Day was almost concurrent with the founding of Synagogue Ranch. We wanted to engage in ecology, not necessarily as professional scientists, but we know enough about ecology that we can do way better of restoring ecosystems than, you know, the business as usual, as we call it now. So those 3 lines of work, you know, as soon as I heard that, I said, well, here is a group that, you know, gives a chance for someone to live a fairly balanced, civilized life. And learning by doing, that's where all the fun is, really, is doing it yourself, and doing it, you know, and you can do a certain amount yourself, a certain amount you need creative groups around you to supply the, you know, both the manpower and the expertise that you may lack. Next slide. So we engaged in Synergy Ranch, and I was talking earlier, you know, one of our heroes, you'll see a slide of him later, was Buckminster Fuller. And Synergy, of course, really attracted us because, you know, according to the physicists, everything is running downhill. Entropy, you know, governs the day. And I have to say, you know, looking at the way we've been interacting with the biosphere, I think, you know, human civilizations have created wonderful things, but in toto, and especially I think since the Industrial Revolution, highly entropic. You know, we're disordering natural ecosystems, we're disordering human cultures and the human organism as well. It's kind of a lose-lose kind of proposition. So synergy, the definition of synergy is a whole where the whole has properties that are unpredicted by the sum of the parts and are greater than the sum of the parts. So the ideal was, as we, you know, founded and started new projects, was to try to figure out what was the synergy in this biome or that biome. So we transformed, and the goal at Synergy Ranch was pretty simple. This was a desertified ecology like most of the Southwest. We wanted to create an oasis and kind of demonstrate that having people, you know, intensively living there, running enterprises, doing all kinds of handicraft, building, that we could actually be a force for increasing biodiversity and biomass, restoring the ecology around us. And I was put in charge of gardens and trees, which was pretty amusing to me, because I'm a New York City kid and I knew literally nothing. I had never, you know, put a seed in the ground. You know, when I first looked at tree seedlings, you know, probably country boys could tell, but to me, I thought there'd be like, you know, some little, you know, God-given indication. This is exactly where the roots begin. This is the bit that you put in the ground. You know, but this is the fun of learning by doing. And you know, we had said early on, we're willing to deal with people, you know, if you've got skills, wonderful. Sometimes it's not so wonderful because you have a programmed idea of how it needs to be done. So we're willing to work with willing incompetence, because if you're incompetent, you can learn. So if you're on the learning curve, you can start anywhere, and in my case, I would say it was pretty much at 0. So one of the things that we did at the ranch was we had a huge tree planting program associated with building and bringing in hundreds of tons of horse manure to improve the impoverished soil. Next slide. And so I planted in 1975 a 400-tree fruit orchard. We planted about 1,000 trees, and then later on, this is in the last decade or so, I ran an organic vegetable operation, and that's us at the Santa Fe Farmers Market, etc. Next slide. Then in 1978, so we had the idea, in 1973, the 4 years after we began our work, we founded, and we called it the Institute of Ecotechnics. And it was partly inspired by Lewis Mumford, who had written a book about the history of human technics and civilization. And he was saying, I think the chart came up yesterday, machine man, machine culture. He was saying as an alternative to megatechnics, which he saw even in the 1950s as kind of enveloping the world, we needed to invent a biotechnics, you know, techniques that's sensitive to human life. And ecotechnics were just taking that idea and saying, you know, techniques needs to be sensitive to not just human life, but the ecological systems and the biosphere of which we're a part. And, you know, it's sort of clear when you think about it, and this is even before we had met the great Russians in the field, but there's the biosphere and the technosphere. Technosphere, you can kind of think of it, it's everything that humans do. Our farming, our ranching, our industry, our commerce, our cities, etc. And these two elements are what we wanted to bring into a greater harmony. So we decided, let's be practical people. Let's take on challenging projects in different biomes of the world so we get some kind of a more comprehensive view of our planet than just working in one biome. And let's take on a project that's in an area of ecological devastation or destruction, cultural conflict, and where conventional economics don't work. It's also a really great formula for getting yourself to really cool parts of the world where land is inexpensive because it's considered fairly useless. So in 1978, we had started another project, and this is the Kimberley region of West Australia. You have a picture in your mind of Australia. It's 2/3 of the way from Perth down in the south to Darwin, which means that we're only 1,500 miles from Darwin and 2,500 miles from Perth, i.e. Crocodile Dundee country. And so there are millions of hectares. This is kind of the New Mexico destruction in the tropical savanna. So the government said if you could demonstrate that you could revegetate, regenerate the pastures here with drought-resistant grasses and legumes, we will sell you 5,000 acres for $1.60 an acre. Wow. Now, of course, doing that took 10 years of really hard work. Next slide. And unlike Synergy Ranch, which was pretty much built with shovels and wheelbarrows, on this scale, this is tractors, bulldozers, heavy equipment, to accomplish this task. Next slide. And also some really intense, this was my Pilates and my Feldenkrais and my gym exercise, was what happens in this part of Australia is you don't just get straight outright desertification, you get invasion of these acacia, these wattle trees. And our basic approach was to go out and spend 2 or 3 hours in the tropical sun, hand grubbing them out.
You look like Tarkovsky actors there.
Yeah. Yeah. And these are later pictures. So we got into breeding horses that were more adapted. These are Quarabs, quarter horse Arab crosses, really well adapted to the culture. And working with Aboriginal kids is a heavily Aboriginal area as part of the cultural conflict. And actually for these kids, and the Aboriginals were kind of like the unsung cowboys of Australia's outback. They had a great tradition. They'd only temporarily, been put into cities and allowed to buy alcohol. So we had really marvelous luck with Aboriginal kids of motivating them. You bugger up and you don't get to ride a horse today. Next slide. And with 20 years of really intensive work, we turned the property is called Birdwood Downs after one of our grasses into a real pastoral oasis. Next slide. All right, that's the savanna. Now what about the tropical forests, tropical rainforest? So this is Puerto Rico. This project began in 1983. And again, Puerto Rico is the fastest reforesting country in the world because people have abandoned farms and ranches and gone to cities and emigrated to the United States. And we wanted to demonstrate, and it imports 99% of its wood. So the government was really simpatico, very cooperative to a project which would try to build an approach to sustainable timber in the rainforest. So this project is up in the mountains of Puerto Rico. We're 20 minutes from a Caribbean beach and an hour and a half from the San Juan airport. And it's really steep land. So this 1,000 acres, 3/4 of it we're leaving, it's regenerating as a secondary forest. But on 1/3 of this acreage, we planted about 40,000 tree seedlings between 1985 and 1990. but using a method that's minimally disturbing. We line cut little strips through the existing secondary forest, put our seedlings in there, so we basically not disturbing the secondary forest. And wherever we found valuable native trees, we left them in those lines. This is called forest enrichment. And you can see some of the products. These are mahogany and maho trees that grew from little whips. Now some of the thinnings are this large. So there's been a really good project. We knew it was subject to hurricanes, and by Jove, Hurricane Maria, the eye passed directly over this project. So we're in a major rebuilding of the project in a hurricane-proof fashion. But the Ecotechnic people who ran this project began to discover that there were beautiful hardwood trees that were literally being chipped up and sent to landfill because Puerto Rico had lost its forest industry. The wood products, the secondary use of trees was totally gone. So even before the hurricane, they began, finding out where these, in some cases, 80-year-old teak and mahogany trees were being cut down and literally turned into landfill, and saved the city governments by salvaging those woods. We had portable sawmills that we were using for our own trees. Then next slide, when the hurricane hit, the destruction and downing of beautiful hardwood trees was on a massive scale. People now estimate there are at least 100,000 beautiful hardwoods that are, unless we can change government policy, headed for landfills. And under some innovative projects, we got the cooperation of both the Puerto Rican and FEMA, the national, the federal agencies involved, and have managed to save a couple of thousand. We're still battling the government. In a few days, a piece that I helped write about changing government policy in Puerto Rico is going to be online at the Ecologist. So that's still an ongoing battle. But over on one side, you'll see some of the grains, and Puerto Rico has got probably 30, at least 30, incredibly beautiful hardwood timbers that most of the world has never seen. We all know about mahogany and teak, but many of the other ones are just spectacular. So it's an ongoing fight, but it kind of exemplifies what we have been succeeding is raising to the Puerto Rican people and government agencies and universities' attention that this is a resource that really needs to be used, especially given that Puerto Rico's in, as everyone knows, terrible economic situation. Next slide. Then, we're modern ecologists, so, the old ecologists would come to the middle of Chicago and say, this is an oak hickory biome. Let's ignore that there's 5 million people in the city here. So yeah, if you're an ecologist and you ignore the city, it's kind of like, the elephant in the room. So we wanted to have a project also in 2 of the anthropogenic biomes. The anthropogenic man-made biomes are cities and agriculture ranching. So this is the courtyard at the October Gallery that Tony was mentioning, right in the Bloomsbury area, a few blocks, short walk to the British Museum. Next slide. And the focus of this project was, let's showcase the avant-garde artists of the world. Let's get them out of the box of ethnic artists. And so they invented a word called trans-vanguard. And, Britain is pretty conservative in some ways. So I was there for the 25th anniversary. We finally got a really wonderful piece in the Times of London and all of that. And what did they do? In the middle of the thing, they talked about the ethnic artists that the gallery was representing. So it's still going on. But I'm told now there's a few other galleries that are imitating the October Gallery and showing world artists, let's call them. Next slide. And what kind of an institute would we be if we ignored the ocean, which covers 2/3 of it? This actually, chronologically, was the second of the Ecotechnic projects. And in all these projects, by the way, we call the people working at the project synergists, And they're still following the basic model of enterprise, theater, and ecology. So in addition to the international traveling company that did tours for about 20 years, Theater of All Possibilities, each one of the projects has a studio following the same method. So, for example, I lived for about 10 years in the Australian outback, and our resident company, we did classical plays. We also improv'd outback, kind of wild-ass comedies. Took them to Aboriginal communities, mining camps, our local towns, had great fun. Anyway, so the ship was built in 1975 in Oakland, California, and it itself is a beautiful synergy because we wanted to have a ship that was going to be cheap to build, ferrous cement. You've got 30 people, basically you just have to feed and house them, not drawing salaries. Ferrous cement is a wonderful modern material because it's got the flexibility of steel and the strength of concrete, and very cheap to build. And we decided to go with Chinese junk sails. They're very easy to manipulate in heavy water. And so we ran this through computer simulations, had a marine architect advising, but basically this was based on the drawings at the Greenwich Naval Museum of the ocean-going junks that the Chinese had in the Middle Ages, which may have discovered the oil. That's another interesting topic. So this is about 84 foot. Next slide. And it is, in its lifetime, sailed more than the distance between the Earth and the Moon, 270,000 nautical miles. 2 years up the Amazon doing ethnobotanical work. So some famous people. We were very good friends with Ian Prance from New York Botanic, and then Kew Gardens, and Richard Evan Schultes. So Wade Davis, the Wild McKenna brothers.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
If it was a sailboat, how did it sail up the Amazon?
It also has auxiliary engines.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we sail as much as we can, also for economy and enjoyment. I was on the ship for three months in the Caribbean. So yeah, we use sail as much as we can, but in fact, it's an interesting story. Brazil had a military dictatorship. This is 1980 to 82 when we were in the Amazon, and they wouldn't let us stop and do any observations of what was happening to the Amazon in Brazil. So we had to go 2,000 miles to Peru where we had permits to do collecting. And actually, we worked with the sons of the shamans and the military people that Schultes had known, four decades before. It's been to Antarctica. We did a complete circumnavigation of South America. Anyway, very legendary ship. Very interesting. We've had as many as 9 different nationalities in the crew. And the idea of the Heraclitus was, well, we need to study, planet ocean. I think that was Arthur Clarke said, we don't even have the right term for this planet. It's not planet Earth, it's planet ocean. Just take a look at it, people. And so, probably one of the oldest cultures are called sea peoples. So the idea of the Heraclitus was not to have a ship like a yacht to where you get from point to point, but to actually have a way of life where you live with and on the sea. So anyway, next slide. And our last project, we did some consultancies in Kathmandu and Caravan of Dreams in Fort Worth, but the story is complicated enough. Our last project also became our main conference center. This is just outside of Aix-en-Provence, France. So kind of a revivification of a traditional Mediterranean mixed ecology holding. This is all of 17 acres, 7 hectares, next slide. With a beautiful old building. This was the last conference that we held there, the Mediterranean one. And from the beginning, since we're learning by doing, we also wanted to meet all of our heroes and kind of have interesting conferences, pretty much off the record, where we brought together really wildly diverse, scientific disciplines, artists, explorers. I think we were naive enough to not understand that, artists is supposed to be over here and scientists over there. Now it's all the rage to bring them together, but I mean, why would you separate them? in the beginning. And I should mention, you know, the motto of the Institute of Ecotechnics, which I really liked, was honor, discipline, beauty, and friendship. So these are really important things. And one reason, I know Tony hates PowerPoint presentations, told me to get almost all the words out of this, so you're not going to be trying to make out tiny print. But the thing is that, you know, we wanted to make all of our projects inspirational. I mean, first off, you know, we are products of this amazingly beautiful biosphere. And the only thing that redeems modern architecture to me is that it's very transient. But we wanted to, i.e., not built to last, and thank goodness. By the way, it's wonderful. I guess this is maybe Tudor or Stuart, I don't know if it's architecture, but, you know, we're not scrunched down in modern architecture, you know. You gotta make the architecture small enough to make the people feel small. Anyway, so curiously, this beautiful house with, I don't know, 23 rooms in back of us, this is not even a chateau. This is a prosperous French farmer from 300 years ago's house. Anyway, so it's been a great venue for teaching members of the Institute and also forging networks between people who, you know, normally don't rub shoulders with other great scientists. And what we found is kind of the people at the top of their field, whether they're artists or scientists, they really want to, they've done enough getting up the ladder and, you know, fighting off competitors and all that. They really want to see the big picture. So, yeah, economy, airfare, good food, good company, stimulating conference. We got some amazing people to these meetings. Next slide. And just an illustration, this is Bucky Fuller at our 1982 Galactic Conference.
Is that you, Mark?
No, that's actually Bill Dempster.
Okay.
You'll see enough of me later. Yeah, anyway, so at these meetings, which were great educational tools, but, you know, it's kind of funny because when we get to Biosphere 2, we think, now that idea was just emerging, particularly in John Allen's brain, about this time. But if you're going to build Biosphere 2, kind of running the Institute of Ecotechnics and getting hands-on experience in all these biomes, having these conferences to meet the really creative engineers, scientists, thinkers, artists around the world is a really great preparation. Next slide. Oh yeah, before we can get to Biosphere 2, let me introduce you if you don't know. This is Vladimir Fornetsky, who is a brilliant Ukrainian-Russian scientist who basically, you know, preceded Gaia and laid out the modern scientific understanding of the biosphere, that the biosphere is not a passive passenger, but has really transformed the Earth in its 4 billion years of activity. And the rest of that slide.
What year is he? What year? What's
He
his
died
name?
in 1945. He was in Paris and published his seminal book on the biosphere, I think in the mid or late 20s. But, you know, brilliant thinker. He founded biogeochemistry because he began to realize that a lot of mineral deposits that were thought to be mineral were actually the action of life. The guy on the other side is Claire Folsom, and he was on our project advisory committee. And that flask he's holding is one of the first closed ecological systems that he was the first one, and then 2 or 3 other people followed him. They began studying these microsystems with high microbial diversity, and to their surprise, they found that they're indefinitely persistent. You know, as long as they don't overheat and have a source of light, they continue functioning as long as you take it from any kind of slice of nature, because diversity is so deeply ingrained. If you try to make one of these systems discretely picking species, they will pretty much always fail. So we built both on Vernadsky and on Claire Folsom in thinking about what Biosphere 2 would be. Next slide. And at the time, the leaders in the field were then the Soviet scientists. They had visionaries in their space program who, you know, way back at the turn of the 20th century, were talking about space greenhouses. So they weren't like the Americans with Goddard and a few of the other rocket pioneers, only rocket people. They were thinking on a more comprehensive way that to live into space, we would have to bring a life support system, and to make a life support system that doesn't have to be supplied from Earth, it would have to be pretty much independent and biologically recycling all of its elements. These are two photographs. So their most advanced work was in Siberia at the Institute of Biophysics, and this project was called Bios 3. And we realized that we really needed to make an alliance with the Russians to gain their experience. And so I had the great pleasure of being kind of our emissary from Biosphere 2 to Moscow in 1985. And as soon as I started describing what we were planning at Biosphere 2, they got it. Because they knew that this was, that this system, most advanced in the world, had about 14 crops grown hydroponically, a couple of vats of algae for atmospheric regeneration. They had to bring in most of their protein, and they didn't deal with all of the human byproducts, let us say. But it was very advanced work. But they could see Biosphere 2 would put closed system at a Fornetskyan level, at a biospheric level. And so they greeted us with open arms. Next slide. And we held a conference, the first international conference on biospherics, closed ecological systems. That's the top slide. And Joseph Gittleson at the podium was the director of the Bios 3 Institute of Biophysics. And then we had the really marvelous thing of having some of their leading scientists from space agencies and that Bios 3 project visit the biosphere. That's the photograph on the lower left. And this is during the closure, and that's Oleg Gazenko, who is the head of the Institute of Institute of Biomedical Problems in Moscow. 300 PhDs working, and they actually, would put satellites out. That was the institute that put Laika into space, the first monkeys and cosmonauts, and he was kind of the unofficial father figure and psychoanalyst to the cosmonauts. So he had great insight into the human drama that was happening inside Biosphere 2. And on next to him is John Allen. Next slide. So Biosphere 2, and just briefly, if you haven't heard of it, you may be in better shape because there's been so much misinformation, in my opinion. Now, it was a complex project with, at least 4 objectives. The one that was kind of the sexiest and easiest for the media to get their minds around was this was a space colony. No, this was not a space colony. We were very aware that it was a very large human construction in Arizona, in the Arizona mountain desert area. But we certainly were thinking that eventually we'll start with Bios 3, kind of limited space life support, hydroponics. But eventually, both for the psychic health of the people who are going to live in space and for ecological resiliency, we need to make much more diverse systems. We need to make mini biospheres. But, Biosphere 2 was not designed to be flawless, like if we were on Mars, if something went wrong, people might die. It was, to begin the learning curve of how to build these systems. That was one purpose. The other purpose is, at a lot of our conferences, we met some of the really great space scientists of our time. And, in the early 80s was just emerging this idea of comparative planetology. And you're all pretty familiar with it because those stories are in the papers all the time that, by discovering the history of Mars or Venus or Jupiter, etc., and our solar system in toto, we're learning, the characteristics, why Earth is similar and why it's different than other planets. So one of the ideas behind Biosphere 2 was comparative biospherics. Now, if there's anything that we really need to understand is how biospheres operate, because we are, right now destructively testing how much, human population, industry, chemicals, etc., before our biosphere, starts to lose basic function. So we named this project Biosphere 2 for, 2 reasons. One, a little setup. and people would come up and say, oh, where's Biosphere 1? Is that a failed project, in Nevada? Or, no. Biosphere 1 is actually what we're all living.
Yeah.
So, it had that purpose, but also, hey, by the way, what I love about this group of semi-mad people that I've been working with, we may have limited resources and limited numbers, but we don't have limited ambitions. So the idea also was this was going to be the first of the comparative biospheres. This was, designed for 100 years lifetime, so it was really built well.
Wow.
But the idea would be that there would be a Biosphere 3 and 4 and 5. The Russians, before they ran out of money after the collapse of the Soviet Union, were really intent on building one in Russia that would be polluted to the gills like their country was, and they would use that biosphere, the Russian Biosphere 3, to figure out ways of cleaning up the soil and the air and the water and the food and all that. We did the opposite with Biosphere 2. We wanted it to be as pristine and pollution-free as possible. One, because we're nervous about, the health both of the people inside and the life systems inside. So we have space precursor to advanced living facilities in space, comparative biospherics. We also thought that on the enterprise side, this was going to be a quiet research facility. We would sell it to Euro Disney or the Japanese or Los Angeles or London, someplace where people come in large numbers. Oracle, Arizona, Arizona has a tourist season that's basically 4 months because it's too hot other times of the year. So we seriously thought that we would make our money back in selling other biospheres, and because we're making a closed system, i.e. very little, almost no material enters or leaves, we'd have to innovate in ecological technologies to solve problems. And the fourth one, so as you know, it didn't turn out to be a quiet research facility. Somehow some media came there and one media story fed another, and then it touched this nerve to where millions of people eventually started coming to Biosphere 2. So we realized we're in the biospheric education business, which I think actually may be one of the best legacies of Biosphere 2. So it was a complex project with the idea
But
that we would...
bad media bring millions of people there?
Because they told the location. We built a beautiful model of Biosphere 2. So I think the first story must have been like 84, no, it had to be like 86 or 7. And they put it outside against the mountains. It looked like we already built Biosphere 2. Biosphere 2 took 4 years of actual building and 6 years of an associated research endeavor to design it properly. But it seemed like, and then literally they looked to me like pilgrims. They started, renting cars in Phoenix and Tucson and driving out. We had no visitors program.
Even though it wasn't built yet, or was it then built?
Yeah, no, they'd just seen media stories.
Ah.
So we instituted a tour program, and by the time we went inside, I think there was like 500,000 visitors came. But they've been coming by the first the dozens, then the hundreds, then the thousands. And it was really interesting. I mean, if you're doing things right, sometimes you are involved in a project that kind of like, it has a life of its own. In a ways, it wasn't even us that was building Biosphere 2. I think it was like, the world was building Biosphere 2. And certainly we had so many countries, once it gained its presence, that were totally happy to give us animals and plants and allow collections to happen. So it touched a nerve around the world, and I think people could really relate to, this is a biosphere, and the word biosphere was very rarely used back in the mid-'80s. I mean, it seems surprising now that I had to spell, the company behind this was Space Biosphere Ventures. I'd have to spell biosphere like 4 out of 5 times. So we reached, 1 billion people by the time of re-entry. So biosphere education, became a very important element. Next slide. So the first battle was the engineers, when they saw the design of Biosphere 2, said, oh my God, this is going to be so hard to build. Why don't we just do it like a big box store? And our architect said, you know, I told you already that beauty is definitely one of our major values. Okay, we're presumptuous enough, we have enough chutzpah in my language, Yiddish, to even attempt to build a human-designed biosphere. We are not going to build an ugly one. We're going to build something that's going to be kind of like a, hey, big biosphere, we know we're small, but this is kind of a tribute to you. So they designed a really kick-ass architecture. We use as much natural materials, wool and wood inside to minimize outgassing. And it was also a tribute to world architecture. There's barrel vaults, there's step pyramids, there's geodesic domes. You know, wonderful kind of nod to the history of architecture. Next slide. And so this is the other part of Fornetsky. He was one of a small group, Théâtre de Chardin, a French philosopher, who came up with the word noosphere in the 1920s. Nous is the Greek word for mind or intelligence. So what they could see from this conflict between the biosphere and the technosphere was that humans would have to really, you know, gain some deep understanding, not overstanding this. We're overstanding the biosphere, we've seen the result. Deep understanding so that we could, you know, harmonize our actions with the complete reality that everything is interacting with a global biosphere. He said that would be the noosphere, that would be the next step. And when I think of, if you guys have heard the term Anthropocene, the human-dominated era, I'm thinking a lot of people are scared, and maybe rightly so, about that. But I think that Anthropocene is, you know, really increasing the necessity that we, you know, kind of up our game and, you know, step up to the plate and moderate our activities, you know, in accord with that. So when our Russian friends first came there, Gilson got up and said, "I love this project, but you gave it the wrong name. It's not Biosphere 2, it's Noosphere 1." And definitely in a small system, as you'll see, you have to be incredibly intelligent, or you're quickly going to poison yourself and all the life inside. Next slide. So there's a schematic of all of the different biomes. You know, Biosphere 2 was a mix. It was all interconnected in terms of air and water flow, but there was a wilderness section with rainforest, savanna, tropical desert, fog desert, a mangrove wetland system, a living ocean with a coral reef. Those are the wilderness biomes, and then there was a human habitat, that's the opaque section, and the barrel vaults covered the half-acre intensive agriculture biome. Next slide. Real quick tour, because I'm going to show you a 3-minute video. This is the rainforest, so just typical of the challenge. So we had some of the best rainforest ecologists in the world, both from Kew and New York Botanic Garden. We said, got half an acre, you know, okay, we're in the, you know, the high intensity Arizona desert. Design us a quintessential rainforest. And not only a quintessential rainforest that gets you the feel of a rainforest, but within it we want to have 5 or 6 different ecological zones. Okay. And I need to, you know, say this because it was really, even if we hadn't built Biosphere 2, the 4 or 5 years of design were so interesting because we had really crackerjack engineers and really top of the line ecologists who normally never speak to each other. And I used to joke, and there was incomprehension on both sides. They had to find a common language. I used to joke that they couldn't insult each other because literally one had one jargon, another had another. So the engineers are like, ecologists, you want a rainforest and a stream and a waterfall. We need some numbers. I think, except he's falling asleep, Richard could relate to that. We need some numbers so we can engineer what you want. And the ecologists, you know, they usually see engineers and they run for their lives. The bulldozers are coming, the bridges. And yeah, so anyway, the two cultures. And then the engineers had to get, you know, they almost rebelled when they realized that all of their out-of-the-box, really innovative engineering wasn't going to make this. They were necessary to support life, but without life, Biosphere 2 wouldn't be habitable for one breath, one drop of air. And engineers kind of pride themselves, we're what keeps people safe. our bridges don't fall down, our buildings don't fall down. But, in Biosphere 2, and I think there's some big lessons, technology was the supporting act. Every bit of technology had to fit the right requirement, that it couldn't pollute the system, and it was there to enhance and replace functions that the natural biosphere gives us. So that whole process was incredibly interesting. Next slide. This is the savanna. Again, how do you do a quintessential world? This is a composite. The rainforest was more Amazonian. You can see two of our designers in there because the grasses grew luxuriantly during the 2 years. Next slide. So this is probably the most tour de force was to install a living coral reef. This is Gay Alling, who helped design and was in charge of managing the coral reef. So we had a coral reef in a 1 million gallon ocean, which took an enormous amount of tender loving care to make survive and adapt to the conditions. Next slide. And that's a view of the ocean, which included a beach. There's kind of a wall there, and the engineers came up with vacuum pumps so that they could produce the waves that we needed in the ocean without killing the marine life. And a system that I worked a lot in and really loved is, this is the Everglades wetlands, about 40 miles from freshwater wetlands to red mangroves right by the ocean, compressed all these different salinity gradients in about 200 feet. Next slide.
Sorry, did I miss what was your role in here?
I didn't say it.
No.
Later.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry, let's go back one. This is the fog desert. So the desert that we had to have in Biosphere 2 with an ocean and a rainforest just 100 meters away was a fog desert that would adapt to high humidity. And now I want to show you, because it'd be a shame for you not to see still photographs don't quite get it. So this is a 3-minute video where we're going to take a tour through the facility. You can get an idea. As a human construction, it was as tall as 75 feet to allow for rainforest trees to grow. It was like 550 feet, that's what, 160 meters or whatever, in length. And it covered 3 acres, a little over a hectare. So a little overview of that. Again, the lungs, I should say, were connected by an air tunnel to the biosphere, but that was our lungs that went up and down to allow for pressure differences between the biosphere and the outside. So this is now going to take you into the human habitat, we called it. This is 65 feet up. At the top of the habitat was a tower library, and psychologically we could look out on Biosphere 2, and of course we're in a beautiful mountain setting. This is in the habitat. We call this the command room. Each of the crew had a computer here, and we had about 1,000 sensors, so you could monitor what was happening from that. Now we're looking at the half-acre intensive agricultural biome. And this had to go beyond organic standards because everything cycles really rapidly in a biosphere. So we couldn't even use organic sprays that are approved by organic farming. That's actually me harvesting some azolla growing in our rice paddies. We had about 40 different crops, mainly vegetarian, but we had some domestic animals. You saw the chickens. Those are pygmy African goats, mainly for milk. And of course, we had to have a kitchen. Couldn't use gas. Really worried about air pollution and fires. This is where we shared our meals. That's the waterfall, and so that's the simulation of a cloud forest in the rainforest. Now we're going to take one of those Steadicam, tours from one end to the other end of the wilderness area. By scale, the savanna's on top, the ocean below, that's 35 feet. So As a human construction, Biosphere
Next
2
one.
was pretty
Mark?
wild. Now we're going over the
Mark,
lowest
question.
Savannah.
How did you film this?
I think they ran some kind of a wire,
Oh.
Steadicam.
Oh, yeah.
You
So
know,
it's like a drone.
Yeah,
It's not
it's a
another
drone.
drone. This is the stairway up from the ocean to the Savannah. Now we're cruising over the mangrove area. Those were, brought to Biosphere 2 in huge planters, 1 meter on a side and 1 meter deep. So we brought the water and all the invertebrates as well as the mangroves. Now this is the technical basement. We call this for short the Technosphere, because a lot of it was located here below, the systems you were looking at. And if I had to do this over, we should have, enabled people to see. Hopefully, I didn't want to load this with too much science, but the book has got, way more of it. What was wild about Biosphere 2 as an engineering challenge and a living challenge was that all the cycles were incredibly sped up. So cycles like CO2 were literally 1,000 times more rapid than in the outside environment. And it was truly a cyclotron for the life sciences. That's a little graph of how much fluctuation we had in CO2. And so we always joked we were on this calorie-restricted, nutrient-dense diet that our doctor had pioneered. So we were getting younger. That cleans out your cholesterol and builds your immune system while you're losing weight and hating every moment of being on this diet. But we were also in this time machine because all of the other cycles were being sped up. And one of my colleagues, Gay Alling, thought that part of our adaptation was, I think unconsciously, we're so attuned to, the biosphere that we live in, that part of the adaptation as biospherains in there was our bodies kind of getting the rhythm of the world that we were living in. It's like, yeah, and the great surprise, if you remember the coverage, was, and of course we knew there were going to be surprises. Actually, more surprising than the oxygen seemingly mysteriously disappearing was that most things worked really well, and we actually stayed in there for 2 years. That was highly uncertain and probably highly unpredicted. So oxygen began declining, and in a way, in retrospect, it's kind of an easy, oh yeah, we had young plants, the biomass of the green plants was increasing rapidly. Things really grew rapidly in there. And we had a lot of soil respiration. So CO2 production and oxygen production were out of balance. What made it mysterious is that where did that oxygen go? It went in the form of a CO2 molecule, that's O2 plus a C, into unsealed concrete, which to me was a beautiful illustration that in a closed system, and did I yet mention, the Earth is way more tightly sealed than Biosphere 2, way more tightly sealed. And Biosphere 2, we achieved, to the astonishment of like the people I knew at NASA, a 1% air exchange per month. So in a facility that big with like 20 miles of seals just on the glass frames, we had a total leakage smaller than your pinky to achieve that. So when I say closed system, by the way, just to make it clear to everyone, that means essentially materially closed. Water and air doesn't freely pass between, but informationally open and energetically open. This is basically run by solar power and electrical and heating and cooling that was in a power plant outside. So this was great, and also, what do we take for granted? So this decline meant we were climbing a mountain very, very slowly, and we got into about 13,500 feet. After 16 months, the oxygen was about 14.5%. That's 1/3 lower than what we have in this room right now. And when we decided finally to inject oxygen for health reasons, we went into these lungs, and suddenly I heard running feet. We were all laughing. I hadn't heard, anyone run around, because both the restricted calorie diet makes your body go into a little bit of slow motion, and the exuberance. What a high just having oxygen. And like many of the things in Biosphere 2, it's very difficult to separate those two factors. We in fact weren't climbing a mountain, we're at the same 3,900 feet elevation, about a kilometer, that we had begun. But the oxygen, so mountain climbers experience that, and the literature on oxygen deprivation is largely from mountain climbers, but they're literally changing their atmospheric pressure.
When did this happen? This decline of oxygen that you had to.
Well, it happened gradually, and
Yeah.
we started in September '91. It was in January '93, 16 months later,
Oh,
when our doctor couldn't add up a row of numbers.
yeah,
At the outside,
Oops.
medical people said, "We're making this call."
yeah.
A lot of us
16
were
months.
all for, let's just see, how far
Wow.
how far we could go with this. Yeah, actually, so everything that new that happened meant more research. So this was actually part of both our general physiological research, but we added a lot of studies to document what was happening with oxygen deprivation. And the nutritional studies, we were the first humans studied under that, low calorie, high nutrient diet. Next slide. And research in the system, by the time we left, there were 60 projects. That's me and Linda Lay remeasuring trees. And, people thought, it's gonna be kind of an adverse life system. But in fact, our trees doubled and tripled in size in 2 years. It was quite astonishing. We went in a bonsai biosphere, and it was growing up, and we were growing up as biospherains. That's me in a wetsuit because the water was cold in the savannah collecting leaf litter. Next slide. So just a quick word about, I already mentioned, the agricultural system was interesting in several ways. One is that we had to have enough diversity of crops that if some failed, we could substitute. And we had to be absolutely scrupulous in making sure that we didn't pollute anything that would get into our food or the water or the air. Next slide. Just a little visual of, so we were using beneficial insects, crop rotations, and we grew everything from grains, vegetables, tropical fruit, little bit of meat and milk, but quite little. And it turned out that this was one of the most productive half acres ever designed, because we had the ability to, recycle and water as we needed. We also had to, and there's a whole other story, recycle all the nutrients. And it was a fantastic diet. If you're interested, Sally Silverstone, who was our operations captain in charge of the agriculture, wrote a cookbook called Eating In, from the field to the kitchen in Biosphere 2. But, people told us it was pretty bland. We didn't have any processed sugar. So bananas and papayas made our sweets, and we invented a biosphere ice cream without using much milk, etc. Next slide. So, some of the eco-technologies that came out of this, we didn't invent this, but we kind of took this up to another step. It's also called soil biofiltration. It's more used in Europe than it is in the United States. And some early engineers discovered, we have this nasty, stinking sewage plant or factory, and usually around factories there's a lot of bare soil. So they said, well, let's just see what would happen. Let's take our exhaust from the factory and run it through the soil. And lo and behold, soil microbes. So what is a stinky, nasty trace gas to you and possibly dangerous is food to some kind of microbes. So when we discovered this technology, we said, let's go one step further. Let's grow plants in soil that's also purifying the air. So this was going to be the first commercial product. That looks like an ordinary house plant, but underneath it, it has a little air pump. So the air inside, in this case, is the emission control, that office, and people, materials, computers, well, everything is outgassing in the wonderful world of molecules. All of that internal air of the office space is being pumped up through the soil And we found that, if anything, it improved plant growth because there's really good aeration. So we did lots of studies on that, and we designed the entire Biosphere 2 farm was a soil biofilter. It had a plenum, and we could pump in 24 hours if we needed to. We could pump the entire volume, internal air volume, through the soil. Next slide. And then here's another one of my jobs. I was the sewage manager of a small world. Hey, for a Brooklyn-born kid, this is pretty. Now, the really wonderful thing, and we worked with NASA on this, is this was a constructed wetland, and I had never heard of these things. I think they're a little bit more known. But clearly, when you get in a closed system, there's nowhere where you can throw anything away, and you don't want to throw anything away because it all needs to come back and recycle. So the really beautiful thing about, and we had 2 of these systems in there. One of them was for the human habitat, all the shit and piss and kitchen byproducts and laboratories and workshops, and the other one was for domestic animals, etc. So it all went through these constructed wetlands and produced more green plants, helping manage the CO2, and we cut it for fodder, so we were getting more milk and eggs, from the product. And the remaining nutrients in the water was put back into the irrigation supply. So this is a really elegant system because we're returning all the nutrients and none of the water is wasted, which you have to do if you're in a closed system. So being in a closed system kind of concentrates your mind on, how do we get everything back in play and not have things drop out or be treated as waste or trash. Next slide. So after Biosphere 2, I went back and I got to the University of Florida at Gainesville, did a PhD with H.T. Odom, and what I decided to do was take those systems and make them even better. So instead of having open water, they're all subsurface flow. So I built some in Mexico where we collected coral reef materials because they had huge sewage problems and it was all getting out on the reef. And then I started a company called Wastewater Gardens International. These 2 sets of slides, next slide, are examples of, so they look like beautiful gardens, tropical if they're in the tropics. We put the first constructed wetland into Algeria and, combining the beautiful with the beneficial and the profitable with the pleasurable. We decided to make it a crescent moon shape, which is a huge symbol in Islam. And that's so great that the Algerians are now trying to scale that up. That was built for 150 people, but you can build these systems for thousands, tens of thousands. National parks, like in Poland, we only use native plants, so it's very adaptable. You can make really small ones, you can make ones that serve hundreds or thousands of people. Next slide. Shameless promotion. So this book is my chronicles of 20 years in the shit trade. I'm thinking of Dylan Thomas, adventures in the skin trade. And I had to write this book. One is because the misuse of sewage is a huge disaster. It's a tragedy. I mean, millions of kids die not from the disease, but from the fact that their water is polluted by sewage, and then they get typhus and diarrhea and all the rest of it. And it's also incredible. My joke is, next to sex, which is like the primary thing that people lie to themselves and to others about, they certainly lie about shit. So I mean, I've been to so many places and lied to by so many different types of people, homeowners, government officials, you name it, hotel managers, about what really was happening with the shit there. So, I had to become, like a shit Sherlock Holmes, even to find out what deplorable situation we needed to improve. So it is going to be the funniest book, and there are a few postcards. I didn't bring any, but if you're interested, this is published by Synergetic Press. That's based at Synergy Ranch. Next slide. So why did I become a biospherian? I'm speaking way too much. I'm sorry. I love talking about this, and it's such a complicated story. I had 24 hours in this test module. There's a night photograph. That's the lung for the test module. That's the test module. John Allen was the first human that we put in. We called him Vertebrate X, kind of as a joke. And we were so worried that he had to wear alligator clips even when he slept. so you didn't die abruptly. But what we found is, like I was saying, both the life systems in there and humans in closed systems really do well. So I went in there, and as I've been telling you, I've been reasonably active environmentalist. Hate that word. But, active in working with ecosystems, etc. But within 5 minutes of being in that test module, my world went upside down, because it went from here down to my body, in a really small system, and test module is like 1/3 the size of this room, let's say, but stuffed with plants and soils and all kinds of systems. You totally get that every breath that you're taking is because of these plants. The connection of you and life becomes absolutely visceral. And it was an amazing, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful experience. So after the 24 hours of the test module, I threw my hat into, we had a pool of biospherian candidates, and I began training. Then through really good luck, I got selected for the first crew. Next slide. So the human experiment, learning to be a biospherian. So that's the 8 of us. Actually, that was the 1-year anniversary. We're on the Biosphere 2 beach, and that's what we have. Normally, we worked in dirty jeans and torn t-shirts, barefoot, because most of our shoes had worn out after the 2 years. Anyway, we dressed up for the occasion. And the next few slides just give you some of the idea. And I think what I love about the whole thing about having that experience in Biosphere 2. Can we do the next slide? So I'm not going to explain all of these. We had inter-biospheric arts festivals sharing our creations inside with outside musicians and artists. But we had a lot of roles that I think we really need to have in the outside. We were really worried. I mean, the big prediction was CO2 was going to rise and we'd be out of there in a month or two. We wouldn't get through the first winter. So we had to become atmospheric stewards. We really watched CO2, we regulated our activities, we shut down composting worm beds during in the winter, less light, CO2 went higher, summertime, the reverse. So we became atmospheric stewards and managers, assisting our biosphere and trying to plant more green allies to suck up the sunfall. We were also defenders of biodiversity. I mean, Biosphere 2 was a fantastic, sort of explain the essence of Ecotechnics to you. This was like the ultimate Ecotechnics. Could we get eco and techno, harmonized enough that one side didn't win to the other's detriment inside Biosphere 2? So it was a huge experiment in ecological self-organization. Each one of the biome designers put in way more plants and other species than they thought would persist, but because no one knew what the loss rate would be. But we didn't just stand around. If we saw that there were invasive vines that were choking trees and depriving sunlight, we intervened, and I called that action. We were team biodiversity. So we were intervening in a limited way as necessary to, basically defend biodiversity. Next slide. And we were farmers, we were researchers, we were technicians, keeping all the machinery going. We were encouraged to express in poetry and in journals and writings and musical pieces. There was a Bio 2 band that came in with instruments. People were painting inside. So unlike the Right Stuff astronauts, no, don't give a stiff upper lip. No, we wanted to, and I think we felt that responsibility. We've got this great privilege of being the first people in a human-made world. We want to share those experiences. Next slide. So the biospherian handshake, which I later learned is not that rare, because that's the prisoner. And we thought we invented something. And we had no pets, but up in the upper left there, that's a Galago. We had a small troop of pro-simian African, related to monkeys. We had parties, so we evolved a culture. Even though we were limited in our food production, although we got a lot better the second year. We saved some so we'd have periodic, birthday parties and festivals, did home brew, all the rest of it. It's kind of interesting. That's a shot from the inside of that meeting with Kazenko and John Allen. Excellent. And, it's pretty easy to appreciate. I love that slide where it looks like, the Biosphere 2 is somewhere out in space, and the Earth's in the atmosphere. Especially at night, you could really get the sense when everything is quiet, no visitors on site, a lonely truck, might be, somebody going to the power plant, cruise around that we might be on another planet. And that dream, that was a wonderful exercise, by the way. I'm still processing, sit with 20 people, share dreams. But that dream was the most ecstatic one I had. That one of Biosphere 2, starting to elevate. Next slide. So, I know I'm a bit over time, but I wanted to share this. This is a 1.5-minute re-entry speech. A little taste. So we had, this was beamed out to apparently close to 1 billion people in 1993.
Mark Nelson.
What an extraordinary moment. What an extraordinary world. They said it couldn't be done. Here we are. 25 years ago, I was just graduating from university. But Buckminster Fuller changed our consciousness about our planet by calling it Spaceship Earth. But he also pointed out that we were given this marvelous spaceship to voyage around the solar system and the universe, but one key element was forgotten. Nobody gave us an operating manual. What's really been an amazing experience is that the 8 of us and the enlarged biospheric team on the outside have for 2 years struggled and more or less made an operating manual for a world. What's been surprising and profoundly wonderful is that that operating manual has changed the way I operate my organism. To live in a small world and be conscious of its controls, of its beauty, of its fragility, of its bounty, and its limits changes who you are.
Was that Jane?
That was Jane Goodall. Yeah, we had Jane Goodall and Sylvia Earle. We had some really luminary people.
Can we ask questions? Did you take food in?
That's
when
not
you...
the end. We're really close to it.
Okay.
Okay, so why did I write this book? I'll tell you, I'm still processing 2 years. I'm so happy that I kept a pretty detailed journal. After the first few months, I wasn't writing for posterity. It was also psychotherapy to write down what was going down. And Tony didn't mention, but there's another amazing book that Tony was the editor of with Gay and myself that we were writing as the experience was unfolding. But that was such an amazing experience. Kevin Kelly, do you know Kevin Kelly? Kevin Kelly was the editor of Coevolution Quarterly, helped start Wired magazine. He managed to spend an evening in Biosphere 2 somehow, as he says, his minders got lost, lost track of him. And he was saying just spending an evening in Biosphere 2, this before closure, was so a momentous an experience that he couldn't imagine what 2 years were like. Well, I'm still processing those 2 years and pushing our limits. Maybe I wish I'd written it 15 years ago, but maybe I couldn't have. I'm still digesting, and there's 2 chapters on the human experience. We have limited time, but maybe questions now or later you can bring that up. It was a struggle with the human beings, but on the other hand, we were all in that state of being totally connected with our biosphere. And whatever difficulty we had, there was a power struggle on the outside about the direction. of Biosphere 2, there was conflict inside. You know, that love and teamwork that we needed to keep our biosphere going never got challenged, never deviated in one whit. So a lot of that, you know, is in pushing our limits. It's a resource. It's not that technical, but I've got a detailed bibliography, so there are many, many papers and studies that will point you to. Next slide. And then, you know, this is kind of my only very wordy slide. But, you know, I've come to think that one of the fundamental things, you know, maybe the first thing, we're not going to solve our problems on planet Earth through a techno fix or through this or that. We have to change very profoundly, and each one of us is, you know, required to do this work. We have to change our biosphere paradigm. We have to understand, because everything that I've said, and we'll read the book about that relationship that the 8 biospherains had with our mini biosphere, is exactly the same as we have with our global biosphere. You know, so understanding that if our biosphere is unhealthy, we're unhealthy. That's equally true here. We have to make that realization visceral, not just in our thinking. And I think, of course, you know, with the tools that you have as fourth-way students, that shouldn't be that hard. But, you know, I had mentioned I don't like the word environment because it kind of contributes to that feeling that here we are in our human world, in our human body, and nature is somewhere outside us. No, we're part of it. We're part, you know, we are a product of evolution. Every breath, every metabolic thing that our bodies does is part of the metabolism. That was that feeling I had in that test module, is I had entered into this metabolic system and now I was a part of it. You know, my breathing was not bad. It was the food from plants that were giving me oxygen. So, you know, I hate the word environment because it's the wrong paradigm. It's not outside you. And also environmentalists who like wag the finger, you know, mainly you have to be a better boy and not do that or girl and not do this and not do that. That's not it, because it starts with basically getting out of illusion and delusion. We, in fact, you know, what I'm pointing to is in fact our reality. And, you know, to invoke, you know, Gurdjieff, you know, certainly you don't repay the debt of your rising if you don't even understand that, you know, what it is that, you know, made you arise and of which you are a part. You know, so getting in that reality, you know, is, I think, going to be, first off, very restorative to the psychic gap that modern people have, that certainly whatever you think about progress, etc., you know, we're the only, you know, few centuries of human history where people were not in intimate contact with nature. They're mostly farmers, etc., hunters, gatherers, you know, treating the earth as sacred. And I think, you know, some of that feeling that people who make that connection, I think it comes naturally. I'm not a deist kind of guy either, but there is something very sacred about the biosphere and about us, that we're part of the biosphere. We are metabolically and even spiritually a beautiful part of the planetary biosphere. On the last slide. So, the approaches of ecotechnics and biospheric can help us to learn to live. Now, I hate the word sustainable. I don't hate it. I think it's a really useful thing that people are even using the word, and that also was absent 25 years ago. But I'm really much more now on the thought that we have to be in a regenerative relationship with the biosphere. You know, there are a lot of parts of the biosphere and human civilization and economic systems that certainly are not eternal and I don't think deserve to persist. We need to regenerate the biosphere. You know, I've worked a lot in third world countries. I've seen a little bit of the state of our global biosphere. I think, you know, we're going to look back at the Industrial Revolution as kids with toys who didn't understand the implications of these technologies. We're going to look back at these centuries of basically assault and unknowing destruction and degradation of our biosphere as a time of destruction. And clearly what's needed now is for humans, each each and every one of us. Inside Biosphere 2, there was no anonymous actions, there were no small actions. Because when you're in a very small system, you can monitor. You open up a can of glue to make a plumbing repair, you'll see that in the readout of all the trace gases in the atmosphere. That's happening here, but we don't have the data. So, I think that we are at the beginning of the Noosphere, the Anthropocene, of humans stepping up to, okay, the dread word, our destiny as intelligent, cooperative agents working in harmony with our biosphere. Can we bend your schedule a little bit for some discussion and questions? It's infinitely flexible, okay? Moving on.
What's the legacy of Biosphere 2? What happened?
Oh, well, that's not the legacy. The actuality. So Steve Bannon was involved in the takeover. Isn't that funny? You know, Steve Bannon. Yeah, he was one of the bankers. So we had a falling out with our investment partner, who was one of the best. Well, yeah, no, it's ironic.
Don't get
I know,
too identified now, please.
Faction sometimes really exceeds fiction. But anyway, so we had a falling out, and of course, Biosphere 2, you know, because we were in the media, you know, at one point we were lionized and single-handedly saving the world, and then we were part of a cult, and it was all fake science, and then it was a failure, because something, you know, of course, I like to emphasize, we built Biosphere 2 to find out what we didn't know. If we knew it all, we just would have put that model out there and, you know, and maybe made some computer simulations, etc. So, you know, we learned way more. So it was dismissed as a failure. And I think the thing is, you know, during the time, it was radical enough. It was really radical. You know, we kind of downplayed how revolutionary it was. Now when I talk about it, I kind of emphasize it. And I'm not a paranoid, but certainly Biosphere 2 is an affront to the way we're running the planet, the way we designed our Technosphere, you know, and many other things. We literally had Mr. Toyota. You want to talk about another faction fictional moment? So Mr. Toyota of the car company comes with his, you know, corporate entourage. Oh, I love your project. I love your project. You know, there's only one thing that makes me unhappy. You don't have one of my beautiful cars in there. And we weren't game to say, Mr. Toyota, if we had a car in here and turned it on, man, we'd be out the doors, you know, within a minute or two. We didn't even have birthday candles. We were so worried about it. So there was a corporate takeover. Then Columbia University ran it for about 8 years. But they weren't into closed systems. They got rid of the sustainable agriculture, which to me is a mystery. Well, that sustainable agriculture was to industrial agriculture. We are highly productive, beautiful food, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So they kind of turned it into a global warming laboratory. Thank God it's, you know, it still operated it. They did some very kick-ass, if I can use that word, research with our coral reef and our rainforest. They did some very seminal studies, but they basically put up dividers so that they could study the biomes. So, you know, the other I didn't realize how radical it is, and it's crazy that it's even controversial, but studying people, technology, and nature is outside the bounds of usual restricted, dominated by reductionist scientists type of science. Then Columbia left. For a while it looked like it was going to be torn down. Ed Bass, you know, we were 50-50 partners with Ed Bass in ownership. He donated it to the University of Arizona. I'm really happy. Columbia, you know, followed this party line that it's a world-class engineered facility, but all the science that came before was nothing. Because they just didn't understand it, I think. Anyway, University of Arizona is much more appreciative that really important work happened early on, but they're still operating, you know, Biosphere 2 at a little bit of its potentiality, because we're back to the paradigm that the scientists come in to study the rainforest, or study the mangrove, or study this or that. but it's still operating.
Wow.
And it's such a marvel that if you're in Arizona and you really should go, pay the money.
Yeah.
Now you can tour right through the facility because it's still kind of breathtaking architecture.
You say you inspired the Eden project.
Yeah, we inspired the Eden. Yeah, so the legacy goes on. I have time in the book, and I kind of explore it. And one of the legacies is, I've been to some really remote places like in Mexican coffee, Indian villages. And for the hell of it, I do a slideshow on Biosphere 2, and the kids come up and they say, we've seen these images, and you coming here is like an astronaut is landing. So who knows, how many minds were changed. And so again, it's so good that the architect said, no, we're not gonna build a functional biosphere. We're
Yeah.
gonna build a beautiful one to, inspire people. And so all of those minds, and the premise of Biosphere 2 is inherently optimistic. We knew that there would be problems in the unexpected, but the premise of it is that humans could figure out how to make technology, agriculture, humans live compatibly with a range of wilderness ecosystems. So the message that went out to people around the world, was kind of like, it's really hard to visualize the Earth. I mean, Tony was asking us to do that in the exercise this morning. It's vast. It's vast. I mean, I've done a lot of traveling, and I've seen that much of the biosphere. But this was a small enough system that people could see. And inside, I swear to God, it felt like we were in the Kaaba, and people were basically making pilgrimages around the Kaaba, but it was a living, and we accepted, I delighted in the role of, I'm a part of the zoo, this biospheric exhibition. And what are they seeing? They're seeing a human being really in love with the system that I'm dependent on and helping function. I'm taking tender, loving care of it. I think when I go to Biosphere 2 now, I see, the scientists are really happy studying anything. Doesn't matter if it's dying or living. We get to publish our papers, get our professorships and tenure. But if you're living in and with the biosphere, hoping the penny is dropping, you are not a passive bystander. You want to take tender, loving care of, because my God, this is the world that we live in.
Can you say anything about the group dynamics?
I say a lot, and it's actually one of my most cited papers on ResearchGate. I wrote a paper on the group dynamics a few years ago. There's a whole chapter on it. We had studied, and I think it's good in all kinds of groups. We had studied group dynamics, and I have to say I have scars on my face and body from group dynamics gone awry in Australia. The worst thing that happened in Biosphere 2 was a teacup thrown in anger or a few shelled peanuts. But, so I've seen way worse.
That's not too bad.
It wasn't that bad. It wasn't that bad. And actually, Guzenko, who the guy was saying was the confidant of the cosmonauts, he said some of the stuff that went down between the cosmonauts he never heard about until 10 years after they came back from their space station. But it was a challenge, definitely. I mean, group dynamics is
The
difficult.
same 8 people for 2 years.
Yeah, but informationally open, we really encourage visits at the glass. One of our perks was picking up the phone and, so you call friends and, we did the editing with Tony, with prolonged, wonderful telephone conversations. So we tried to, and, unfortunately the internet was really primitive. We had kind of a primitive type of email, but the internet was not like it is now. But, so the tensions were big. The power struggle on the outside, in my opinion, raised the stakes. Because if there's going to be a change of power on the outside, then power allocations, maybe, who's in charge of this and who's in charge of that, is going to change. So that kind of ramped up tensions. But to me, what was beautiful about it was the shared reality that we are dependent on the system being healthy, and we're all committed to it, deeply in our own ways. That overrode all of that, fight, flight, kill, and leave dependency. It's a wonderful book that I cite, and you haven't read it, but W.R. Biome, Experiences in Groups. It's a survival manual for anyone, and we all deal with small groups.
our family, dinners are small group dynamics. And sometimes, so actually when I talk to academic audiences, I say, what was Biosphere 2 like? Imagine the most dysfunctional faculty meeting. But no, but the door is locked, a little bit like Sark's No Exit. The door is locked for 2 years. But on the other hand, it's this beautiful world that we're in. So, it was up and down, but the positive thing, and I am nothing if not positive, because I think that optimism is a yoga. We can't afford despair and despondency. And what I'm thinking about is, we're all in the same boat. If we're all biospherian or potential biospherians out there, we all have a shared interest in there being healthy biodiversity, a healthy ocean, a healthy atmosphere, healthy food on the planet. So I'm thinking that eventually, just like the discord in Biosphere 2, all these national, tribal conflicts are going to give way, because we're the first generation that in any sense are planetary and in planetary communication. Whatever, you may like about shamanic traditions, nobody knew that they were on a planet. And as I mentioned, I didn't even know that planet Earth is so sealed until I began writing papers about Biosphere 2. Planet Earth is incredibly tightly sealed. It's just that the cycles are much grander and larger and take, in some cases, years, what took hours and days. Does that answer your question?
Enough to say, read my book.
Well, if you're an academic, the group dynamics paper you can download.
We should have another 10 minutes.
So,
How long did it take to make it fully functioning so that you could move in?
well, we started planting Biosphere 2 like 4 years before. So we had, it's a good question, because people are like, we're not out of our minds. We needed to have a functioning agriculture for one. And we had harvested a number of crops. So the idea, we grew 83% of our food. We couldn't replace 17% of the food that we used that had been grown in Biosphere 2. The second team, I need to say, poor devils in the second team. It's like, the fifth guy on the moon doesn't get remembered as much as Neil does. There was a second closure for 6.5 months. It got cut short when the takeover happened. But they, with the improvements that we made, including crops, they grew 100% of their food. So we had an agricultural system going, and all the other systems. We probably had 50 technicians inside Biosphere 2 finishing things the day before closure. We did have to finish this, that, and the other. One of our nightmares, a little practical joke, is that somebody fell asleep, and we actually had a ninth person in there when we actually. But it was pretty much functioning. But it was an amazing. There was a period that I called biology with hard hats, because we had our ecologists planting and doing things in biomes, while there were people on the roofs doing the sealing of all of our space frames.
You touched upon it when you said how quickly things happen in one environment. And your relationship with time in there. Can you speak about that just a little bit?
Well, I don't know that it was really very much different. We were quite aware, of the day, of the week. We had a weekly schedule. We were farmers basically for 5 days a week. I was the potter man. In addition to, I had a number of jobs, and I was working on the research. So we were quite aware of weekends, and we decided, hey, it's really demoralizing. All of mission control is having the weekend off. So, we had a little crew on Saturday morning, then we had the afternoon for vacuuming our shared apartments and our places, and cleaning up the kitchen. Sunday, nothing, aside from the poor people. We had a rotating cook and cook helper and narrator. We decided no meetings on Sunday, and then we were like asserting our independence. It's so demoralizing. There's some months in the year, at least in the United States calendar, with no holidays. Well, screw that. So we would make up, this is peanut harvest day, and we would tell mission, we knew that we had a certain amount of leeway. We were working our butts off within limits. We were limited by oxygen and food. You know, we'd tell mission control, man, we're taking the day off. Don't try to bug us on our radios, you know, it's not true. And we saw some documentaries about Polynesian cultures. So, you know, we would have like a pig on a feast day. And then we ate a lot of sweet potatoes. We averaged 1 pound of sweet potato per person per year. So a little sidelight is by 6 months before the end of the mission, we all had this kind of orange tinge to our skin because of sweet potatoes, papayas, and carrots, and beets. 4 crops that did really well in Biospheric Tour.
Being in this closed system and experiencing this, is your view of CO2 the same thing that you see it as the biggest poison of our time? That's usually the general, getting into the general psyche of people.
I have to say, you know, I'm not a meteorologist, but you know, it seems like the evidence is overwhelming, and certainly that was our greatest fear because of the young biosphere. Unlike the Earth, you know, one of the reasons we had those fluctuations is that all of the biosphere would be photosynthesizing during daylight hours, and it would be all respiration, whereas, you know, with the revolving Earth. No, I take that really seriously, but I have to say, to me, the greatest issue is the assault on natural ecosystems, on these biomes, on wilderness, and the idea that, you know, the spread, you know, when I was researching the book to find out that 30% of the Earth's land is involved in cattle production, either, you know, grazing them, raising food for them, all of that, and they're 2% of the world diet. That's scary to me. So, you know, that there needs to be limits to the human, say, territorial aggrandizement of our biosphere and the degradation of biodiversity and wilderness systems. I think that's the first one, and I think it also impoverishes us. You know, we are nurtured by wilderness and making cities green. So I think, you know, I don't mean to minimize global climate change. I think it's enormously frightening. And it's going to be interesting because what I really call for also in the book is to rethink our technosphere. To really rethink our technosphere. How have we become dependent on 70,000 synthetic chemicals, almost all of which aren't even tested before they're used in the environment? How have we put up with air pollution? I mean, I love London, but you know, going from rural New Mexico to London, I can feel my organisms shut down, my breaths become shallow. You know, so, you know, what we had in Biosphere 2, we had our own analytic laboratory. We were so worried about the quality of the water and the air. So we could read out all of the, and there were hundreds, as clean as we were, there were hundreds of trace gases. I'm convinced if in addition to smog alerts and all that, you actually had a readout in Nashville, you'd find out what are the chemicals that we're breathing in the air and what are they associated with. How much is automobiles, I don't know what the industries are, you know what I mean? That we need to get to a level of, we're not gonna put up with this. This is not normal. I mean, what I loved in the outback of Australia is, you know, the atmosphere there was so unpolluted by industry, the water was so incredibly clean. And somehow, you know, we, especially modernized and westernized, you know, humans have, you know, somehow given license to industry to do this. And it's partly, you know, the industry took the path of least resistance without understanding that there would eventually be 7 billion and growing people on the planet, that, you know, one smokestack would beget, you know, 5 million more. Redesigning our technosphere, I think, is also urgently needed. Call it there. Any more?
He basically asked part of the question that I was going to ask about CO2, and you have mostly answered the question, because I have read or heard several geologists who were hired to figure out what CO2 is doing, and they all said the same thing. There are so many influences, we don't know. So your approach is my approach. Don't worry about that part. Deal with what we know and how to fix it, and that's the important thing.
Yeah, well, I don't know enough about that science.
Right,
to
but
be
I
able-
mean, yeah.
I mean,
let-
I had a
right,
friend just
yeah.
recently trying to tell me that the science has some bias in it, blah, blah, blah. But, I think the good news, I mean, the scary news is that we're talking about major changes on planet Earth, a major paradigm shift, which I think basically has an upside. Don't give up your alienation, your imaginary alienation from nature. But a lot of the things that we need to do that will make human life clearly better, our air better, are part of a solution of those other issues. So, we need to approach it where we can make differences in our lives and, what are the really crucial things? And I think the Anthropocene, I really love that idea is gaining precedence. It's long overdue because clearly even Fornetsky saw that, in his colorful language, humans, we have become a geological force on planet Earth, but we don't know what we're doing, So, making the changes in the technology which will lead to a cleaner, air and water and food and greener and more pleasant cities, these will all help with global climate change. I'm pretty sure that there's something going on. I mean, I've met enough of the scientists in there that I don't think that they're just whistling in the dark. And then you look at the destruction of the Earth's biosphere and the loss of biodiversity. I mean, my God, are we going to be, we're going to go down as a generation that saw, already the number of wild animals is a tiny fraction, aside from what's it called? Extinction. Yeah, aside from extinction, we have depauperized the wilderness parts of our world. Are we going to sit by and be the sixth extinction? So there are a lot of vectors that are lining up, that the course that we're on is highly destructive, and it's destructive to us as well. Once we realize we have full skin in this game, we have full breath in this game, we have full metabolism in this game. This is not an idle thing that it's happening in the Amazon or happening in Greenland or whatever.
What was the impact of Biosphere in the life of the 8 persons?
Oh, I think we were all very profoundly changed. It was funny, it was a very clean world, but because we're losing weight, we gained a little bit with our better farming the second year. When we were studied by biomedical tests, our bloodstream had more pollutants, DDT was showing up. Some of the people had been in countries that continued to use banned substances. And so curiously enough, when you lose fat, a lot of those poisons and chemicals were stored there. So it was kind of like we also went through a Biosphere 2 purge. So first we became more scary in terms of our bloodstream, and then 2 years inside a very clean environment. And we came out healthier. I mean, our doctor was so delighted. That diet, I had cholesterol that was maybe 180 or so, went down to 120 in there. So that was part of the time machine, that we were getting younger medically because of the diet, the clean environment.
And right now, what you're doing?
I continue to work
Some impact. You connect with that.
with the every I tell that story in the book. Every one of the biospherains has continued to do exemplary work. 3 of them banded together and now run the Biosphere Foundation. They're working with organic farming in Bali, doing marine studies, and coral reef conservation. Other of them, are involved in space research. Put the first closed system on Mir space station. And if you know that world record, free fall from almost in space, so 2 of the biospherians are the companies behind that. And then, my work has been the wastewater gardens and Ecotechnics. And spreading the word about the biosphere paradigm change.
I sounds a very vague question, but if you express something about where is the Noosphere?
Where it,
Where is the Noosphere located?
I don't think it's located physically.
Where has to be somewhere.
Well, I think it's gonna be in,
Can
You
you
know-
just
you know,
repeat the question, if you
Yeah.
can't hear it?
oh, where is the Noosphere located? Okay, so my understanding of this is that Chardin, who is wonderful, the phenomenon of man, if you haven't read it, but he kind of took the mystical idea that, we're approaching and the Noosphere is gonna somehow magically, materialize. I kind of follow what I think is Fornetsky's interpretation of it. And it's largely involved with both scientific understanding, and he was a great moral ethics. Moralism has a bad connotation. He was a very ethical man. I mean, he continued to work. One of the wonders was that he wasn't purged by Stalin, and he went back to the Soviet Union after his time at the Sorbonne. But he wrote a book called Scientific Thought as a Planetary Phenomenon. And I think certainly, we know much more about ourselves, the biosphere, through science. But I think that's not adequate. I mean, I think the Noosphere also has to be informed by the human heart and by the human body. I mean, this fact that it's kind of amazing, really, think about it. You come out, you're aquatic inside your mom's womb, and you become air breathing, and then you find out, my God, it's a miracle that I'm here, and it's most amazing that I'm actually metabolically connected. I'm a product of the evolution of the biosphere. Literally, we carry DNA that traces back to Adam and Eve microbe somewhere at the bottom of the ocean, or et cetera. That we're connected to this thing. So, in my opinion, a Noosphere, it's not going to manifest like you can go out and find it on the streets of Nashville. It's going to be the sum total of increased, as you're saying, consciousness is kind of a wormy word, but it's going to be in the actions of collectively of the human race. We are, right now, and I don't advocate it, and I hate environmentalists who say humans are just a parasite cancer on the planet. Bullshit. That's kind of like self-flagellation. Neither are we the crown of creation, but we are certainly the disturbing element. So it's ironic to me that Columbia and the University of Arizona are studying rainforests and coral reefs and mangroves. They have no problem. They're having a problem because of the human impact that they're now facing. So similarly, I think the Noosphere is going to be human by human, as we step into our roles as biospherains.
You say it's going to be.
Going to be. Well, maybe it's here, maybe it's those higher powers you're already talking about.
But, well, I think it was, as I said to you, Mark, in a way, I call it Biosphere 3 or the Noosphere, was in you guys. He was actually located in you because he was the birth of the Noosphere. When Gitterson said the Biosphere was actually Noosphere 1, he was pointing to you because it was only really incarnated in you guys.
Well, except that, the whole mission
And then the
control,
mission, yes.
I mean, Tony Blake has been forever changed by your involvement with Blake. No, really, and I think all the humans who heard about it, but my God, if it's limited to the 8 of us, we're screwed.
But not only this is this parallelism with people from different backgrounds and all times and the occult background and so on, talked about these monasteries, which are powerhouses, and for me the biosphere was exactly the 20th century equivalent. They don't have to wear robes, but you had your own clothes on, and you had your own rituals and so on, but you were doing concretely essentially the same kind of thing, but in a totally different way. But it was being concentrated in you guys, and it has to start from somewhere.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you impute that to Biosphere 2 and not just the human beings inside, I think, one of the things, it was startling to be inside Biosphere 2 and to read just outright fabrications, and, you know, now I sound like Donald Trump, but I'm talking from, you know, we knew what was happening in Biosphere 2, and we would, you know, people would tell us what had just been read, you know, written in the New York Times or Time or Newsweek or Pravda or whatever. And it was just crazy. And I remember when I started writing this Pushing Our Limits, I was thinking, my God, in 100 years, you know, Biosphere 2 may become like the pyramids. And like,
Yes.
who knew why these people built this? It may have been an astronomical observatory. No, it was on a ley line. You know, just total imagination could fill in the void. Biosphere 2 is built for whatever your particular obsession and ideology is.
Whatever you need to prove.
Whatever
We
you
make it up.
Well, anyway,
Space alien.
You're going to talk more about Biosphere 3?
no, I will have, don't want to hear me, but just I was going to alert you about this. The sense about the noospheric side of it is just beginning. It's not just computers.
Yeah.
Anyway, Brave New World.
Right.